Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Gaddis. I'm Medill Jr. and president of the Northwestern chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Rachel Swarns. Rachel Swarns has been a New York Times correspondent since 1995. Currently based in Washington, D.C., Ms. Swarns' reporting has taken her across the country as well as over a few oceans, as she's been based in South Africa and has had opportunities to report all over the world. However, in all her writings, it's easy to say that few stories have been as utterly life-changing as her biographical work on the ancestry of the First Lady of the United States. American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, is a beautifully told piece that not only details the lineage of Michelle Obama, but also gives us a closer look at some of the most controversial years of American history. American Tapestry, in its truest sense, is a supplement to our traditional history books. It interrupts assumed truths that many people have grown accustomed to by bringing to light a powerful account that may have gone unknown otherwise. As journalists, we all know that a good story is nothing without a great storyteller, and through her eloquent prose and uncanny talent for rendering a complex story in an engaging narrative, Rachel Swarns offers her readers a new understanding of the interwoven lives that form the fabric of American life. The retelling of history can be a hard truth to swallow, but Swarns aids her readers in their exploration by setting up this story with thorough and compelling details. Ms. Swarns, who is married to Medill alumnus Henri Colvin, a Metro editor at the Washington Post, is the mother of 2 sons, and part of the amazing story of the making of this book is how she managed to juggle the demands of her personal life with the crafting of this story. I'm sure we will hear a bit about that this evening as well. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Rachel Swarns.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My husband is weeping that he is not here. He was an editor of the Daily and said I should talk about the Nebraska game, and I'm just not going to do that. Actually, we're going to have a conversation, I think, mostly. Jessica's going to ask me some questions, and you guys will too. But before we do that, I'm going to show you some photos and just tell you a little bit about how I got started on this project. And this project emerged out of an article that I wrote when I was covering Michelle Obama for the New York Times. And it's not a typical job to write about the First Lady of the United States. Typically, that's something that's covered by the White House reporters that chase the president around on Air Force One or in the briefing room, who cover the first family when they can, when they have time. But in 2008, there was a sense at the New York Times and at other papers too that we should do things a little differently. There was a sense that this family, this African-American family, this first African-American family living in this house built in part by slave labor, would be written about for generations to come. And as you all know, we journalists like to think of ourselves as writing the first draft of history. And so there was a sense that we should chronicle that. And that's how I ended up covering the First Lady. My editor said, "Would you do this?" And I said, yes. And this particular book emerged out of an article that I did about the First Lady's ancestry. And the seeds of that started very early, in fact, around Inauguration Day, when a colleague of mine was writing an article about the president and his rainbow family. And at the very last minute, we realized, oh goodness, we don't know very much about Michelle's ancestry. And so we asked a genealogist to do a little digging. But in typical journalistic style, we didn't give her any time at all, and so she didn't find very much. And so the story ran about the president and his rainbow family, and we thought that was that. Except that the genealogist got hooked, and she kept digging and digging. And in the fall of that first year that the Obamas were in the White House, she called us back. And she said, I think I've come across something remarkable. And would you guys be interested in writing about it? And of course, we were. And so I got on a plane to Birmingham, and I knocked on doors, and I spent a lot of time in the archives and in the libraries, and looking for anything that I could find, anyone who could talk about a man by the name of Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, who was biracial. And at the end of the day, in October of 2009, the story ran on the front page of the New York Times. It was mostly about Dolphus's parents, the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother, whose name was Melvinia. She was a slave girl valued at $475 in 1852, and her great-great-great-grandfather, who was a white man whose identity was a mystery. And there was a lot of media stuff and a lot of hoopla. I got to be on TV a lot, which I don't like. I'm a newspaper reporter for a reason. But the very next day, an editor at HarperCollins sent me an email saying, wow, that's interesting. It's kind of a little snippet of the First Lady's maternal line. And, would you write a book about her family tree? And, my first response, quite candidly, was absolutely not. I've never written a book before. I have young children. I have a mortgage. How in the world would I do such a thing? And my husband said, please don't tell that lady, no. And he reminded me of a story that I told him when I came back from that trip to Birmingham. I had spent several hours in an old cemetery looking for Dolphus's grave, and I was armed with all my paper, from the archives, which said he was in this plot and this row and everything, and I went out there, and it was one of these old, neglected cemeteries, the grass up to my knees, and as you may know, back in the day, even the dead were segregated in the South. It was one of those places. So I spent hours there, utterly unsuccessful, as many of my deep dives into history were. But at the end of those 2 or 3 hours, I stood there and said to myself that I couldn't imagine anything else I'd rather be doing than digging through the nation's history in that way. And so my husband reminded me of that, and so I didn't tell the lady no, and I embarked on this project in January of 2010. I'll just tell you very quickly, because I know we're going to have a conversation, but I basically traveled all over the country. Her ancestors were scattered across the South, in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, some Mississippi, and then across the North too, Illinois, as we know, but Ohio, Michigan, some New Jersey. And what I came away with was a fascinating story, a very American story. The First Lady's ancestors were African Americans who toiled on vast rice plantations. They were mixed-race people who lived free for decades before the Civil War. And they were Irish Americans who nurtured their dreams in a new land and fought for the Confederacy. And there were remarkable people who populated her family tree, remarkable characters. And I'll tell you about 2 of them because of their Illinois connections. The First Lady often describes herself as a South Side girl, and in fact she was, as you know, born and raised on the South Side, as were her parents. But her family had no idea how deep those Illinois roots really were. And the First Lady's great-great-great-grandmother on her father's side arrived in Illinois sometime in the 1860s in Villa Ridge in Pulaski County in Illinois, southern Illinois. And her great-grandmother, Phoebe Moten Johnson, who was born in 1879, the daughter of sharecroppers who decided somewhere along the way that she wanted nothing to do with the farming life and traveled to about 4 different cities in her 20s, was among the first in the First Lady's family to see the skyscrapers of Chicago in 1908. And her family, they were a range of people who were railroad porters, sharecroppers, carpenters, postal clerks, who and her family journeyed from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. And it is in many ways a remarkable story and a very uplifting story. On the other hand, it's also a hard story. The First Lady has long suspected that she had white ancestors hidden in her family tree. And one of the things that I was hopeful that I could do was to try and find out who some of those ancestors were. And through DNA testing, I was able to identify for the first time the white ancestors in her family tree, and to identify the living, breathing, distant relatives, white distant relatives that are scattered mostly across the South, who are living and breathing and grappling with this history today. I'm going to show you a little bit about these photos here, so you can see for yourself the American tapestry that her family encompasses. But along the way, as I was, digging and reading and writing about these people, I realized that what we had was not only the story of an amazing, remarkable, and very ordinary family, but also the story of the country itself. And that was one of the things that was most appealing to me about it. So I won't talk too long. I'm gonna show you some of these slides, and then we'll talk and you can ask questions. This is Michelle Obama as a little baby, as you can see, with her brother Craig, who, as you know, is a basketball coach, and her father and mother. Her mother, Marion Shields Robinson, is the side of the family where Melvinia, the slave girl, is on. This is Joan Tribble. In order to do the DNA testing, I had to find people who I thought were related to those white ancestors. And I suspected from the beginning that those ancestors were, utterly unsurprisingly, members of the family that owned Melvinia. And so I looked for those descendants. And as you might imagine, it was difficult for some of them, this newfound knowledge. A lot of people might like the idea of being connected to the White House, but not usually in this way. And so for some people, the idea of a reporter coming to knock on the door and saying, by the way, your family owned a member of the First Lady's family was deeply unsettling. And some of them wanted nothing to do with me and my work. But some of them were willing to grapple with it. And she was one of the people who she didn't want, she wouldn't have asked for this, but she felt like this history, even though it was hard history, was her history. And so she went on this journey with me. And this is Jewel Barkley, who is the great-granddaughter of Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, who also shared her memories and her photographs and her DNA. This is Dolphus Shields' daughter. I mentioned that Dolphus lived in Birmingham. His family started, his children and grandchildren moved north, and his daughter moved to Cleveland. And this is Dolphus Shields, the First Lady's great-great-grandfather, who was biracial, and his son, Willie. And Dolphus was quite a remarkable man in his own right. He was born into slavery in 1859, 1861, moved to Birmingham sometime in the 1880s, became a property owner, owned his own business, was a founding member of two churches that still survive today. And when he died, the news of his death appeared on the front page of the local black newspaper there. And this is Dolphus as an older man. Dolphus and his family outside of his home. Pardon me, I've got a little cold, I'm sorry. The tombstone of the man who owned Melvinia. The tombstone of the man who we believe was the man who fathered Dolphus Shields. This is the First Lady's aunt, Francesca Gray, with some photos. This is Phoebe, who I told you arrived in Chicago sometime around 1908, and her husband. And this is the First Lady's great-great-grandmother, I mentioned, who arrived sometime in the 1860s. And the family story goes that she is part Cherokee, and if you look at her, you could see that there's obviously some racial mixing in her family, though I was unable to determine conclusively whether or not she was indeed Cherokee. And this is unfortunately a mislabeled slide. This is the First Lady's grandfather, not great-grandfather. He came from South Carolina to Chicago in the 1930s. And for a long time, even though I saw a photo of the man who we thought was the First Lady's great-great-great-grandfather, they wouldn't share it with me for the book. So this was the only photo of a white ancestor from that generation that I had, and he was Melvinia's owner's brother. One of the remarkable things that happened after the book came out, and after an article about the book came out, was that I got an email from a reader who said, you know, I think this might be my husband's family, and by the way, I think we have a photograph of those people. I was kind of like, really? And in fact, it was true. And so this was the first time that I was actually able to see a lot of the people who I wrote about. So the man with the beard is Henry Wells Shields, who owned Melvinia. And there's a little girl, and then his wife, Christian Patterson Shields. One of the fascinating things about this story is just how the diversity of experience among people during slavery. The Shields family, they were not wealthy people at all. They were struggling yeoman farmers who worked the land with their own hands. He married the daughter of a wealthy man, and so they inherited their slaves. And the man who is standing kind of looking off into the distance, looking a little better dressed than some of the others, is the man that the DNA suggests is most likely the father of Dolphus Shields, Charles Shields. I'm going to skip past this one. And this last one was taken in June of this year, when the town, Clayton County, erected a monument to honor Melvinia. Clayton County is where Melvinia was enslaved. And they invited Melvinia's descendants. And at the very last minute, I thought, well, maybe some of the White Shields descendants would come too. And they did. Some came from Georgia, some drove from Alabama. And they met, they exchanged numbers, they had a meal. I don't know that they're going to be Facebook friends and hanging out for years to come. But it was quite something to see. The descendants of the slaves and the slave owners of the First Lady's family all together was not something that I ever expected when I embarked on this. So I think we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll take questions.